Was sagst du für mir? Also ich verstehe dich nicht.
Let me tell you, Bertie, you're wonderful. You're marvelous. You're not so Yiddish.
Wer ist mir? Also ich pack mir bei. Hier sind doch gar nicht kein Jiden in Amerika.
Say, Bertie, don't insult America. Hast du Street, dat je voor werden verfliehen, da liften alle pushcarts.
Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedmann.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Jewish Museum of the American West, and Atheists United Studios. Hey Joey, how might we travel back in time to lost worlds? Absent a time machine, we must settle for movies, museums, and books, like the one written by today's guest.
We're honored to chat with Henry Sapoznik, a 5-time Grammy-nominated producer and performer of over 50 recordings and author of the award-winning book, Klezmer, Jewish Music from Old World to Our World. His latest book is The Tourist's Guide to Lost Yiddish New York City. Henry, welcome to Amusing Jews.
Thank you, Jonathan, Joey, and Mike for the invite. Glad to be here.
The Tourist's Guide to Lost Yiddish New York City is filled with fascinating stories about Jewish food, architecture, music, and theater from New York's Yiddish Golden Age. What inspired you to put the book together?
Well, the book is a collection of essays. There's 40 essays, and they span not only almost a century and a half of New York history, but also a good 50 years of my own life. Some of these essays are based on work that I've been doing for the last few decades, stuff on history of Klezmer music, on the invention of Yiddish popular culture. What triggered the book as a compendium was after 40 years, I found a record that I had been looking for, the only known recording of a black cantor from the 1920s. I created a website and a blog, and the first blog that I posted about finding the record and the whole backstory about black cantors, it got something like 80,000 hits. So, and I can't actually explain why. I don't understand the system well enough, but I kind of figured, well, something. So that led to a series of other researches on other black cantors, and it ended up being like 8 different posts. And that to me was like, there was a huge narrative. I know you want to talk about the black cantor thing. In which we will. Briefly, when I tried to get a black cantor his book published, I couldn't get any traction. So I folded it into a book of essays, and in a way, it's a really good thing because it places the context of why this would have even happened. If it were just on the black cantor phenomenon, you may not have been able to step back enough and see what was Yiddish, the Yiddish world, and the American popular world at the time. So it was an expediency thing to write more essays and to do the research. So I was really happy for the opportunity.
Yeah, I was actually teaching at a cantorial school back when your website was launched, and it was circling around that community very aggressively, and I think I was at least a dozen or more of those 80,000. What's interesting, though, is that context that you bring into it is not the usual context. From my perspective, reading this book, not necessarily being an expert in New York, but knowing kind of the generic stories, like everything that you put in the book is something that I didn't know before, kind of the oddball or the less covered material. I'm sure that was part of the approach.
But the oddball thing really does make sense because for a long time, the received narrative of the history has been kind of the top shelf, that the idea that using mass culture or using popular culture as a yardstick was really looked down upon. It was called ephemera. Wasn't even essential. It was ephemeral. And luckily that has changed. And in fact, the popular culture and mass culture are an incredible barometer for being able to gauge how successful a minority society is at both navigating through the dominant, society, but also holding on to their cultural identity, and how it gets kind of adjusted to fit. So I love it because it's it's kind of shameless because it is popular. And it's sort of moved ahead by its popularity, that you could look at it and say, yeah, this is there was no other really intention other than how do we manifest ourselves in this society. So it's a rich repository of material.
Yeah, I think one example of that is just how many different people claim to be the Kishka king.
Well, we all know there was only one. I'm very partial to that story. I have to the photo that I reproduce on the cover of the Kishka King delicatessen was taken the year that I was born around the corner. So I actually remember. That's weird. I hate intruding on history, but the Kishka King was. Even now, I still have a slight bit of heartburn left over, but yeah, and I think what it's also like all of the chazantas, the women cantors, who all said that they were the only one. It must have been a dozen. I mean, it was a million plus of women who were amazing story. Also,
Enjoying the show? Click like and subscribe.
Among other things, you're an expert in Yiddish film. I've long been intrigued by Irish actor James Cagney's fluent Yiddish in films like Taxi from 1932.
Im Wieso Beine gehen auch unter dem
Schweig,
Ellis
schweig,
Island.
schweig, ich verstehe. Du willst gehen zu Ellis Island, dabei bist du?
What then? Du bist ein Jüdischer hier.
Nu, wo ist denn? Shake it. Hab sich rein.
What do you know about Cagney's exposure to Yiddish, and what does this tell us about Yiddish New York City?
well, Cagney is an incredible dynamic force because he is a product of the city. Born on the Lower East Side, grew up in Yorkville. His proximity, and this is the same kind of thing that I found about the Black Cantor, Thomas LaRue Jones. Here were people who were living in a powerful Yiddish cultural soundscape. They were really taking in a lot of that dynamic culture that was being produced. And people like Cagney and Thomas LaRue were able to internalize it, and not just to reproduce it, but actually own it. And one of the great things, P.S. Cagney speaks Yiddish in another film, also in 1940, The Fighting 69th. There's a Yiddish sequence, and but listening to him, and of course Taxi, it's a great the sequence. When I talk about Yiddish film, I think by really hands down the best filmed and the most well directed sequence in all of Yiddish film is the sequence in Taxi with Cagney and Joe Barton, the actor who plays the befuddled. Cagney's Yiddish is so homey. It's so owned. It's not a vaudeville stage Yiddish. It's it's a living on the street, buying food, clothing Yiddish. It was a Yiddish meant to be used and understood. And it's a fabulous and Cagney, think about it. If you think about the film Taxi, the Yiddish sequence is the second scene in the movie. I mean, usually these kind of ethnic depictions get relegated to later. You need it as a comedy relief, but something was going on that this was Cagney's choice, because he had only recently scored the major hit with Public Enemy. And Warner Brothers could not wait to do stuff. In fact, two of the first things that Cagney did that he did not do in other films was speak Yiddish and dance. There's a great dance sequence in Taxi with George Raft, another, not a Yid, we can't claim, and he didn't speak Yiddish as far as I know. But so Cagney represents the ultimate urban resident who is in consonance with his neighbors and respects and owns the culture that he shares and is able to reproduce it. It's a fabulous story. I'm glad you mentioned it.
Yeah, you mentioned Joe Barton as well. I love him in The Tenderfoot, where he's the peddler.
That's a yellow use on longhorns. Got one I use on hogs, too. Want to hear it?
Das mag ich in der Hörst mit der ganze Woche der Hörst. Ach, heute ist so, haben was in der Meme dir was.
I guess you're a native, all right. Can't understand a word you say.
A sad story. I mean, but here was this guy who was actually, in fact, I found another Joe Barton film accidentally the other day. Sadly, he doesn't speak Yiddish in it, but he had a couple of years where Warner Brothers was giving him some screen time as a Yiddish presence, and actually, as you hear, he actually speaks Yiddish. So it's learning who he was, it took many years to get the proper credit, but it came from the great jazz virtuoso Vince Giordano, who is a big fan of old Yiddish films. So it's a great story. It's a great story.
Did I read correctly that you were an extra in Sergio Leone's Jewish gangster epic, Once Upon a Time in America?
No autographs, please. I how many times do I have to tell you? Just back off. Give me my space. It wasn't me. It was my beard. There was central casting. Mike Klezmer band appeared in the film The Chosen. Great experience playing klezmer music for Rod Steiger. It was definitely a peak life experience. Because I had a beard and because I was identified Jewish, I was in the casting Rolodex for Hollywood films that were being made on location. And if as you know, the film Once Upon a Time in America about Jewish gangsters was filming in Brooklyn, and the casting agency, Joy Todd, can't believe I even remember, haven't worked for her in 40 years. They were looking for beards, and there I was. So it's actually a great story. It's in the chapter in the book where I talk about knishes of all things, but I unfortunately, a lot of the stuff, it was such a weird experience because Leone or none of the designers for the film understood Jewish culture, Jewish history. So there were 3 sets, one in New York, one in Milan, and one in London that were of the same scene, but they didn't match. And in 2 of them, the Jewish cemetery is right next to the synagogue. They missed that day, where you learn that in Jewish life, you do not have the cemetery next to the synagogue. And in fact, at one point during the film, when they were going around getting wild sound, they were sending the sound engineer around, and I saw them, and I started speaking loudly in Yiddish. And basically what I was doing, I was saying, this film doesn't make any sense because there were no Hasidim in New York at this time. And look at this, the Hebrew lettering is backwards, and they're recording it, but I don't think it ever got used. The only film with a built-in Yiddish review That would have been a major breakthrough in film history.
I just rewatched that movie, the very long version, the 3 almost 4-hour version the other day, and it's a weird movie because, like, there are Jewish references and Jewish people, I guess, in garb like you, but the film does not feel Jewish at all.
I still the best for me, the best part of the film was the sign on the hearse, the business they had to, "Why go on living when we can bury you for 29.95?" I mean, that's, like, totally beyond, but, yeah, it was a very Goyish, Jewish thing, but, thank God, as I talk about in the book, it was a bitterly cold day, in Brooklyn, and we were luckily right next door to the Gabila Knish factory, and they were, like, pumping out industrial amounts of knishes, and, like, the warm air was wafting, to over the set. There must have been maybe 1,000 extras, all dressed up like Chassidim. And the line during the break of everyone going to the Gabila factory to get the knishes to put in their pockets as hand warmers, it really looked like a religious experience. It really looked like, the Gabila Rebbe and his Hasidim, are like, they're on the move.
You write that Dr. Brown's soda is perhaps the only food product so closely identified with Jews in which Jews were not involved in any part of its development, production, ownership, or national distribution. Could you explain?
Well, one of the things that I talk about in the book was the invention of Jewish restaurant culture, and what of home food, and, like, there's a lot of stuff. How did they develop a bridge from home cooking, from, kosher in the home, to creating a platform, of restaurants? I mean, I point out, it was a transition from boarding houses to eating houses to restaurants. But if you look at all of the food and all of the products that got made, at some point, either Jews were processing it, they were either manufacturing it, they were either distributing it. The whole phenomenon actually of celery soda, which, this was a rabbit hole I was absolutely positive I would never get out of. I was sure that there was no way back. But what I discovered was that, celery tonic and celery soda was a huge thing at the end of the 19th century. And I go into a history of carbonation. God help me, a history of carbonation. Who's gonna but, there were, I don't know, several dozen companies around the country, including a dozen in New York alone before Dr. Brown's, which was one of the other things I found was Dr. Brown was not from Brooklyn in the 1840s. It was, as we say in Latin, an ausgetrachte Meise, a completely made up story. Um, but thinking about it, all other foods that are so closely identified with Jews have at some point a Jewish provenance. The only one that was never, there was no history of celery soda, of celery, I mean, as any kind of presence in Jewish cooking, any more like a potato. But so it's interesting how it became so closely identified with Jews, and now it's almost seen, it's almost, owned culturally as, "Oh, this is our soda," the way the Italians say, "Oh, Manhattan Special, that's our soda." So and so I think that's what it is. I could not find any other Jewish product, not, salami, not matzah, not wine, some product so closely identified with Jews that absolutely has no Jewish provenance at any point.
This could be a shot in the dark, but maybe by drinking a soda called Dr. Brown's that wasn't Dr. Brownstein or anything like that, that by drinking it, you were assimilating in some way to the American culture?
Dr. Pepper would have been, at least there we know that there was an actual Dr. Pepper. I mean, that's, but, assimilation, food assimilation was the toughest one. And I talk about, in the book, I talk about the sort of the taming of the Wild West, in terms of kashrus. That at the end of the 19th century, I mean, it took until the 1920s until there was an overarching agency, the OU, the Orthodox Union, that succeeded in whatever way to establishing a benchmark for kashrus. And so, like, for example, the thing that totally amazed me was that very early in the history of processed meats, salami and so forth, that the delicatessens, that kosher style delicatessens outnumbered kosher delicatessens very early, and it never changed. Kosher delicatessens never outnumbered kosher style, which really says something about the community, that where they will draw the line. That I will give up kosher meat, but it's got to be made in kosher style. And it really talks about where are the lines that the community will draw to maintaining their identity, and where are the ones that they say don't bother me, with these niceties. So yeah, so the assimilation thing, in a food kind of way, happened with other products like hot dogs. I point out that Hebrew National was the first company to manufacture canned Franks and beans as a countermeasure to Van Camp's pork and beans, which was a very popular seller. And this was their attempt to create a bulwark. They say, "Oh, you want meat with a bean product?" And in fact, was the only Franks and beans product on the market for decades, until, in fact, Van Camp's itself. So the assimilation through food was a rearguard action, that there was no attempt, like, for example, you couldn't get milk for your coffee in a delicatessen. I mean, you can now with, places like Katz's in New York that have Reuben sandwiches. It was totally unthinkable that an old style delicatessen would actually actively mix meat and milk in a dish, but it's a thing now. So, but yeah, yeah. So the assimilation thing is really assimilation on a plate.
As you were mentioning, you've done a lot to uncover the lost history of black cantors, or Schwarze Chazanim, in Yiddish New York City. How did you uncover these stories?
I'm sure this has never happened to you, finding something when you're looking for something else, what are the great moments in anyone's life. Actually, two unrelated things. In the 1970s, I was hired as a researcher for a project that was documenting the history of foreign language commercial recordings in America from 1895 to 1942. Tens of thousands of Polish, Ukrainian, Greek, Spanish. And I was hired to oversee the Jewish catalog. And at one point, I was going through the ledger books of a company called OK that was very popular for blues and jazz in the 20s. And this was in the actual recording engineer's ledger book in his own hand. And it mentioned that there was a session with Thomas LaRue, der Schwarze Chasen. I still feel I said, wait, what am I seeing? What is that? It was only a listing. It wasn't like, oh, here, go find the recording here. So I documented it for the book and then promptly forgot about it, because I have to wait until the record, if it ever turns up. Jump ahead 15 years, and I was doing research for the Yiddish Radio Project, the series that I had on NPR in 2002, and I was going through radio listings in the Jewish press in New York, and there was listed Goldie Mae Steiner, the Schwarze Chazante, Goldie Mae Steiner, the black Jewish woman cantor, and I wasn't looking for this thing, but both of those were like, signals. This untold story. It took almost 40 years from when I first saw the Thomas LaRue Jones citation in the OK ledger, that a copy of the disc finally turned up, which is what prompted the blog piece. But what was so to me, what was so astounding, all those years waiting for the record to turn up, I would think about it, and I said, "Well, what do I think that record is? Maybe, you know what? Maybe it's just like a parody. Maybe it's just like some guy making believe he's black or making believe he's Jewish, and he's playing, so, which is not unheard of. I mean, that's what vaudeville, ethnic depictions. So I was thinking, well, despite the fact that the press was incredibly laudatory, but when the record turned up and I heard it, and it sent chills down my spine because there was a sense of lived-in quality. There was real sense of ownership, and not just the command of the cantorial melismas and the infrastructure, those little tiny pieces, but his ownership of both Yiddish and Hebrew. Think about this, two parallel language groups, that it really don't have that much to do with each other substantively. He owned the Yiddish, he owned the Ivre, he owned the singing styles, and I just said, man, this was worth waiting 40 years to find, that this astounding voice. And the most even more amazing, stop, if you order now, it gets even more amazing, because I found subsequently a recording of a cantor who's 78 that Thomas LaRue Jones copied for this record. And I got to listen to both of them side by side, and to be allowed to enter someone's consciousness about their creative process, especially someone, you now have a yardstick. I said, oh, here is this great cantorial record, and here is what Thomas LaRue Jones created. And two things came out that just totally floored me. The first was that the cantor, the white cantor who had recorded the same piece, was a better, he understood the infrastructure of the cantorial, the architecture of the singing. He understood it way, way better. But Thomas LaRue Jones was a better singer. And in that respect, he interpreted the text more in keeping with the meaning of the text, which in fact made him a better chazan, made him a better shaliach tzibur, a messenger of the people, because he was transmitting the subtext of the text and not gussying it up with beautiful, brilliant melismas. So, wow, here is this black singer who is really into the text of this davening, and it was, as a child who's, I was forced into singing in choirs when I was 6 years old. My late father was a great cantor, Zintel Sapoznik. So I kinda had a sense, and like, I knew what it takes to make, that sausage. And it was a pretty transcendental moment. I have the recording on my website, on henrysapoznik.com. It's so, it was like, do you ever have that dream when you're in your house and you see a door that you didn't recognize? You open the door and it's like a room that you didn't know you had, and it's full of stuff that you didn't. That's what discovering the Black Cantor thing, it was like It was like life on Earth 2, you know? On a parallel universe, there'd be plenty of black cantors, and yet here they were.
How does that phenomenon of the black cantors relate to people like Slim Gaillard and Cab Calloway doing Yiddish and Yiddish-inspired music of a more pop variety?
It was the secular end. Keep in mind, we're talking about people who were creative, living in an active soundscape. Harlem, when blacks started migrating, the Great Migration from the South up to Harlem, it was already the second largest Jewish community in New York. And the black communities were encountering social infrastructure, synagogues, theaters, communal organizations that were the perfectly valid model. So the idea of people living cheek to jowl with each other, and we think about, we're always looking through one end of the telescope. We always think about Jews who are doing other people's music. That Jews have, we great Jewish rhythm and blues players, great jazz players, but we don't think about black artists who internalized Jewish music. And so Cab Calloway, Otazé, one of his big hits, where and in fact he kind of does this little chazanasi thing in Otazé. He does this little melisma, and I talk about in the book the great Harlem Stride pianist Willie the Lion Smith, a Duke Ellington's favorite pianist. And here was a guy who had a business card that had on it Der Jiddische Chazen, totally unabashed, unashamed, that kind of easygoing ownership. Not that there wasn't racism at every turn, but somehow people navigated their way around these things and were able to own and share, and it created a really powerful, albeit short-lived, subset of black popular music.
You also write about female cantorial entertainers known as chazantas. What accounted for their rise to prominence despite, or perhaps because of, the religious ban on women cantors in those days?
I don't think that enough credit is given to vaudeville and the variety stage in its development of mass Jewish culture. I think variety theater and vaudeville did as much, or maybe even more, than night school did for whole generations of Jews. And variety, the sense of that anything pretty much that you could think of, you could put on stage. If you could stage it and you can be on and off in 3 minutes, you might have a career. And there was an overlap. Here was, the American popular theater. We've just come out of blackface minstrelsy. We were coming into vaudeville. And here was the Yiddish popular culture, still had its showroom shine when Jews were coming over from Eastern Europe. So luckily, it was also a time of veneration of great voices. Singers like Galakurchi, of course, Caruso and Chaliapin, all of these fabulous, and cantors, huge selling records, Madonna had nothing on them. There was some amazing popularity. So it kind of stood to reason that something that was familiar yet foreign, something that was something that you had grown up with, but was also something, a real turn on it. There was nothing to really indicate this would be a thing, but suddenly, kind of out of the blue, as it were, one woman, Sophie Kurtzer, a daughter of Chazonim, Orthodox as the day is long, suddenly decides to market herself as a cantor. obviously she wasn't going to do it in shul. In the Reform synagogue, women were already singing on the bima. They were members of choirs, but not in the conservative, and certainly not in the Orthodox. So, how do you manifest this incredible gift? Luckily, mass and popular culture to the rescue. The vaudeville stage, both the English vaudeville stage and the Yiddish vaudeville stage, and the Yiddish theater, and radio, and the Borscht Belt hotels, all of these were active platforms for people who had this incredible skill. I find it ironic that and there were a series of women cantors, and as I point out, each and every one of them, like clockwork, each of one of them said, "I am the only woman cantor." You know, there were like enough for 1.5 million, but each of them. But the tradition of these secular platform women cantors lasted almost up until the moment that women were suddenly being ordained as cantors in the Reform synagogue, and then transitionally into the conservative synagogue. Interestingly, because the nusach had changed. This was a major shift in the role of the cantor, that they were no longer responsible for creating this vocal artistry. They were essentially song leaders. They were essentially singing melodies that the congregation would be singing in, and it changed the interest of this earlier form, and essentially is gone as for most. I don't think subsequent to Shlomo Karlbach and Debbie Friedman, they changed the landscape so that this old style of cantorial was no longer a coin of the realm.
Yeah, and back to vaudeville as well. I've been thinking that maybe the Chazanta phenomenon was aided in some way by just the reality that women impersonating men was a feature of vaudeville anyway.
Correct. Pants rolls were very popular. Some of the greatest Yiddish actresses were famous for their pants rolls, like Molly Picon, and also the passage of the voting rights. I mean, that was the suffrage movement changed everything. I have a chapter also talking about strong women, about this fictional character Yenta Telebenda. Here was this incredible made up character, but people loved her because she gave as good as she got. She was not, like a mealy mouth. So I think you're absolutely right that there was already a precedent in a certain kind of a stylistic depiction, and applying it to the cantor, especially, my God, especially that these women could sing. The recordings, I actually reissued um the first lady cantor. When was it? Is 89. I did a reissue of Cantorial 78s. It was right after my father Oliver Shalom died, and I did it as an honor to him. In fact, after he died, I found recordings in the closet that he had made in a DP camp in Austria of him singing Chazanis. And this is I just thinking about it, I get the chills. They were on aluminum discs. I don't know if you've ever seen acetate discs. It's an aluminum disc with a thin coating of like a rubberized surface where the needle would cut. When I was transferring the discs, the surface had become so dried out that as the needle was going through the record, it was peeling the surface of the disc back. So I had like one chance to make the transfer before I destroyed the record. That was a pretty powerful, but so anyway, the point is the cantorial tradition was super powerful. The women cantors were an omnipresence from the 20s into the 70s. I was going through all the Yiddish newspapers, and it was a real accessible phenomenon, and I think in a lot of ways kind of acclimated the Jewish world ahead of its consciousness. It acclimated the Jewish world to accepting a woman who has internalized the nusach and who owns it in a familiar way. Like all the lady cantors, all the chazentas there were no sopranos, there were no contraltos, they were all altos. So they had the tonality of their voice was like a mature adolescent. So tonally, it was a familiar sound, even though it was a woman. So there was a lot of, like I said, this kind of stuff really helped acculturate the Jewish community in a way that on the surface seems improbable.
You were recently inducted into the Brooklyn Jewish Hall of Fame, securing your place alongside such luminaries as Mel Brooks, Fivish Finkel, Sandy Koufax, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Could you take us through that process?
Oh gosh, honestly, I still don't know how I got nominated. When I heard I was nominated, I called my friend Andy Statman, who had gotten it a few years before. I said, "What's the story?" He says, "No, it's a real thing." I thought it was like Who's Who in America. Sure, we'll put you in the book. It's $100. So it was very sweet. It was a really nice ceremony, and I don't actually, I hope this doesn't mean I'm at the end of my tether here. I'm still, but it was nice, and anything that reminds me of my ancestral area code is meaningful.
So, Henry, what are you up to now?
The audiobook just came out, and I really had a terrific time making that. So I'm on to, just in case you're wondering, what's my follow-up, I have a book slated for next year on the history of Yiddish radio. So I'm really looking forward. So hopefully I'll see you here. Don't go get off the air. We'll just stay right here until we're ready to do this again.
Well, thanks so much, Henry, for joining us. This has been great.
Thank you for asking me. I watched a bunch of your guys' stuff, so I already knew what I was in for. Thank you, Jonathan and Joey. Thank you.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.